We will get started now. Thank you again for joining us. My name, as I said, is Megan Steiner. I work for IU13 as a state lead on human capital strategies. And I will let our co-facilitator, Sharif, introduce himself and his work as well.
Hi, sorry, was trying to find the unmute button. Sharif Al-Mekki, a former teacher and principal of 26 years in Philadelphia, and now leading the Center for Black Educator Development. Happy and excited to be here, as well as a member of the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium.
Thanks. So as I mentioned before we continue, you can see it in the chat and highlighted on the screen that I'm sharing is a tiny URL. If you haven't done so yet, please type that into your browser so you can follow along and follow links to other documents. And if you could please just type into the chat as well your role and the LEA or the organization you work with, just so we can find out who's here. And while we are doing that, I will mention that most of this session will be interactive. Everyone just looking at some resources and discussing them and discussing practices with one another. So this initial portion where it's more presenting is recorded, but once the actual conversation amongst participants starts, we will stop recording. So don't feel like what you say is going to be posted online after that point. So the purpose, as you can see on the Google Doc here, is for us and yourselves to share resources, experiences, and strategies regarding retaining educators of color, and provide an opportunity for all of you to share your own questions, experiences, and actions. Now, I'll start with some brief overall context just about educators generally, which may sound familiar, but just to get us all on the same page. So nationally, some leaders have been expressing since the beginning of the pandemic concerns about educators leaving the profession at higher rates this year, and some particularly about more experienced teachers. So there was an EdWeek Research Center survey from March of this year that showed that 54% of teachers were somewhat likely or very likely to leave the profession in the next 2 years. And this was not disaggregated by demographics, this was overall. And the same survey asked these same educators, if we had asked you back in 2019, before the pandemic, about your likelihood of leaving in the next 2 years, only 34% said, oh yeah, if you asked me before the pandemic, I would have said I was likely or somewhat likely to leave. So that seems to imply a distinct difference there. And experts have been advising proactive retention efforts, including showing educators we care about their views and their plans and taking their input into consideration. So that's just general retention context. As you are likely familiar with this, teachers of color already leave the profession at higher rates than do white teachers nationwide. And there's a report from EdTrust and Teach Plus that Sharif actually shared with me that found 5 approaches in particular that schools can take to be intentional about teacher recruitment and retention. And you can see those 5 here: create culturally affirming school environments, affirm teachers' humanity and racial identity, support, empower, and invest in teachers, build a school-wide family, and adopt a district priority related to retaining teachers of color. So that same link to that same report has some overviews, not just about what schools and districts can do, but also about challenges and conditions in a school that may contribute to teachers of color being less likely to stay, that may cause challenges or, you know, not optimal circumstances, to say the least. So if that is a report you haven't seen yet and might want to check out, you can certainly follow the link right now and bookmark it, look through it, see if there are things there that may be useful to you. I will say it does a good job of going into detail, but also summarizing some of the higher level findings in the report. I also just wanted to give an overview of some resources out there, just examples, but some fairly useful examples of resources for educator retention just in general. So we have on the IU13 site a couple of human capital self-assessment tools that include a section on retention practices. It looks like a long document when you open it up, but you can just go to a particular section that is relevant to you. For those of you from higher ed, the section on recruitment and hiring might be most relevant to you, for example, but it does also have a retention practices section. A couple of other tools from other sources I wanted to point out. Now, we're going to be talking about something called insight interviews with teachers today, which are not exactly the same as stay interviews or stay conversations, but just as one example of a stay conversation, TNTP, which was formerly known as the New Teacher Project, does have a guide to approaching those stay conversations with teachers who you want to retain. There's been, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of resources out there about the stressors that teachers and all school staff are feeling during the pandemic. And one I just wanted to highlight because it's a brief but quite useful infographic is from American Institutes for Research. And it's this educator context and stress spectrum during COVID-19. Now, all of you in different capacities have been feeling this stress spectrum and are aware of how your colleagues and teachers are feeling it as well. But this is just a useful sort of research and expert-based overview of sort of the roller coaster of experiences that on average teachers may have been feeling, just for some more context. And finally, those of you who are from an LEA have access to this school climate survey for staff. It's just an example of items for a possible survey that districts can take from. And there's also some information here about if you don't have a login as a school or district leader, how you can get that if you want to check out those items. Just a couple more of these. So there are some ongoing retention tools specific to this school year related to teacher wellness. Another thing, there's a flurry of resources out there about how we can support teachers and all school staff. It's also the custodians and the cafeteria workers and everyone who's just had much more stressors over the last year plus. And these are a couple of longer documents, but we've noted a couple of brief sections within them that may be most useful, if you're just looking for another resource on supporting teacher wellness generally. So that brings us to the more specific point of this session, which is about retaining and respecting and providing productive workplaces for educators of color and school staff of color. And sort of the center around which this session is based is an upcoming toolkit on respecting educator activists of color. And it is not quite published yet, still being refined, but it will be published at the organization of the Center for Black Educator Development. As Sharif mentioned, that is his organization. And do we have a general sense of when it might be on that site, or is that to be determined?
Don't want to overpromise and
Okay.
underdeliver, but
Okay.
definitely people should be able to access it during the summer.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know that sometimes people hear the idea of a toolkit for something as complex as this topic and think, oh, you can't address that in a toolkit, but it's not a toolkit in the sense of like, oh, let me check this off, I'm done. It is much more in-depth, requires reflection, collaboration, provides insight into what's going on in your school, district, organization. And we are going to talk about 2 drafts of tools from that toolkit. You'll see when you follow the link, it does say draft at the top. The school culture assessment tool and the insight interviews tool. So before we actually dive into those, I will turn it over to Sharif, who can tell us some more about the context of the toolkit and how to use it and so forth. So I will just adjust this so that Sharif can share his screen, and then we will move on.
Thanks again, Megan, for inviting me to participate. Want to just kind of give some context as far as like how we were thinking about it. And again, as a member of Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium, our organization works with other folks. And so we are excited that it's not just a retention toolkit, but there are actually 4 toolkits altogether that people will be able to access across the state, where you can look at retention, but the other 3 will also, which retention will be the first one that will be published and accessible. But after that, over the next 6 months to the year, you should be able to access a culture responsive sustaining education toolkit, a recruitment toolkit, as well as a mentoring toolkit. So altogether, 4 toolkits that you'll be able to use. I was a part of the retention toolkit, and there were members of my team that worked with other folks, who are part of PEDC, and where this was something that was elevated and we found to be important and that people needed. So some of the things, just as far as like the retention toolkit that I had been thinking about, was really like what kept me, excited, engaged, thrilled to wake up every morning and go to Turner Middle School, which is in the background of the school. Like, what about my own activism fueled my work, fueled my reflections, fueled my my insights. As I mentioned, I was 26 years teacher and principal, all in Philadelphia, all in West and Southwest Philadelphia. And the school I started at, Turner Middle School, I was there for 10 years. Started as a teacher, ended up being the assistant principal the last year at the very school I started teaching. And in my head, I thought I was going to be there like for 30 years, but ended up going and starting the principalship at another school. But what kept me in there for almost a decade as a classroom teacher was a lot of what I thought about as we were working together to craft this toolkit. This young man, Terrence Williams, who I'm shaking hands with, he's actually a classroom teacher now, and to think that our students are, in the Freedom School tradition, our job is to find our mentees and train our replacements. And that's, if we look at it in that kind of realm, then retention is a tremendous part of the work. I think a big part of the context is that often you hear people talking about, we're all in the same boat when it comes to teaching and support and your retention, all of those kind of things. But Dr. Howard Fuller often says, we're in the same water, but we're not in the same boat. And anytime you look at the demographics that Megan shared, while, teacher turnover and attrition is this area of concern for us, particularly in Pennsylvania, but diverse candidates, diverse teachers have an even higher rate of attrition, right? And so it's the same water, but it's not exactly the same boat. What is it that makes teachers of color, and Pennsylvania is not unique to this, this is a national trend as well. What makes it different? Why is it the same water, but not the same boat? And so as we were thinking about how to build a toolkit, we knew there are a lot of things that people may be doing that were short-term solutions. A lot of people are like, oh, what can we find a small win? But there are other things that, are harder and systemic. And And folks, it's not just a singular person, HR director, talent recruiter, principal that this lives with. As we built a toolkit, we would really wanted folks as leadership teams, both district and school-based leadership teams to think about this. We wanted principal supervisors to think about this as part of their support for principals, right? And that there would be a stakeholders for a school that looked at all of this, focused on all of this. One area of caution I would say is a lot of times when people are trying to resolve issues that deal with teachers or educators of color, they're looking at the educators of color themselves to fix a system that they did not break from the beginning, or they did not construct in this inappropriate manner. And so that there's other work that has to be done on an individual basis, and to make sure that we have that context as we are entering. And so making sure that leadership teams are looking at this as an opportunity to demonstrate commitment, to demonstrate their own courage, is important. Anytime you're talking about things like race, class, power, privilege, as well as history, these are things that takes courage, it takes a commitment, and in order to move forward. And so this teacher retention toolkit, as I mentioned, a team of folks really thinking about what does it mean to retain educators of color? What does this idea of educator activists look like? And we use this term because in a lot of our conversations, and I've been in this work not only as a principal of 16 years, but also as someone who has now started 2 nonprofits to support educators of color. The first one really targeted current and aspiring Black men who were leading classrooms and schools, was really around why did they join the profession? And many of them spoke about wanting to give back to their community. Many of them looked at the connection between educational justice and racial justice, and that was a reason why that fueled their desire to become educators. And so if that part of their inspiration to become teachers was not tapped into, was ignored, or if they were asked to leave that part, that kind of activism out of their work, if they were policed in a certain manner that separated educational justice from racial justice, it caused a tension that and undermine retention efforts. And so this is the reason why we use this term educator activist, like someone who is active. I myself, I was an activist before I became an educator. And you'll find a lot of people, educators of color who had very similar thoughts, ideas, inspirations in order to do this work. And so just want to, this toolkit and like, what I'm glad Megan brought up this idea of that it's not a checklist. What we wanted to do again, that there were leadership teams using this as part of their school improvement efforts. And we recognize that many school improvement plans just gather dust throughout the year. And so for us, this is a toolkit to be centered at leadership teams, where they are diving in, where they are using it, where they are revisiting it, and where they are sharing it with their stakeholders. And I think principal supervisors, as well as district leadership teams, and hopefully there's a lot of cross-pollination when we talk about leadership teams, that there are educators, school-based educators and leaders who are part of a district's leadership team as well. And so that there's not just a singular school who's thinking about this, but the district at large, and that they are all learning in their context of how to apply this and how to improve on this. This is, by no means is this toolkit an attempt to say these are the only things that need to work. These are the only things that need to be applied. This is really a starting point, but we wanted to be able to provide leadership teams, however they're constructed, the opportunity to be reflective and thoughtful and collaborative in their approach to retain diverse educators, in their schools and within their districts. I would also just mention that um, as we're looking, Megan brought up this idea, and as you dive into the toolkit, you'll see this, this insight survey, and what that means for us. And that does not mean that schools should not use stay surveys and really engage individual teacher or educators to stay. We're not saying that that is not useful. We think that's very important for someone to feel valued and recognized and seen and spoken to one-on-one about their contribution and impact. But how we also want to do insight is really instead of looking directly at an individual's contributions, as huge and important as that is, that school and district leaders are also looking within, looking at themselves and seeing, how am I being courageous? How am I showing a commitment? And how am I being curious about the ecosystem that we are crafting? If we look at Dr. Beverly Tatum's work, and she talks about the smog of racism is ingested by all of us. And this is deadlier for teachers of color career than secondhand smoke. It is something that everyone's breathing in, but if we're not constantly thinking about how do I, extract this out of my system, out of my school system, then what happens? It just becomes a permanent state. It becomes calcified. And so part of the insight survey is asking people, how are they experiencing our leadership? How are they experiencing working within our school? How are they experiencing the culture? Is it toxic? Are we recruiting, but not doing the prerequisites for retention? And so as I go around the country, there are a lot of folks that are talking about recruiting teachers of color, almost as if they're on a safari or something. They're just like, oh, we got to find Black and brown teachers. Oh, find Black and brown men. And they're like hunting, oh, the elusive Black male educator. There he is. Let's go. Like, no, that's not it. Because if you have not thought about how do we create an environment that's supportive, that's anti-racist, that will make a person of color be comfortable, particularly when they're at such small numbers, right? And we have one or two in our building, but we've not thought about what does it mean? How do they experience this mostly white environment? What about our culture is based on default whiteness and has nothing to do with the lived experiences of Black and brown people, as well as students? How do we engage our curiosity to develop plans, to analyze our own behaviors, our own assumptions, our own constructs within the school that can lead to a different type of ecosystem so that people that we are recruiting through the front door aren't exiting out of the back door, within a year or two. So I'll pause there, Megan, but I really just wanted to share, what the context was for us creating the toolkit. I'm excited to get you all's feedback about, a couple of the tools within it, some of the indicators, because as I said, we are still in the process of refining it, and we will continue to do so. So we'll have actually a page once we release this to continue to get feedback from the field of how it's being used, what would people like to see added as we continue this work. So thank you.
Thanks. And one other thing I'll mention, I know that if you just joined us in the last several minutes, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a Google Doc that we are using during this session. And I'll share that now as well. It's also in the chat so that you can follow along to the resources we are talking about here. And I will also share that screen. So thanks for that in-depth discussion of context and of this particular toolkit. And as I mentioned, we have drafts of a couple of the tools here. And first, we're going to look at a draft of the school culture assessment tool, which if you follow that, it goes to a PDF. And this is, again, just a draft, but I think it looks very well formatted and has a lot of great content already. And so Sharif, could you tell us a little bit for the school culture assessment tool, just about sort of the why behind creating this tool and how folks could approach this tool or who they should involve as they do it?
Yes, absolutely. And so a big part of the school culture, and again, that goes back to the ecosystem. Like what is the ecosystem that we want to recruit teachers of color in? And I think at first is a recognition that, what is the default? How was it originally created for? Who was it originally created for? How was it constructed? And often teachers of color may not have been the original architects of a particular culture, or the beneficiaries of it, right? And so when we talk about the relationship between students of color and the school systems, the apparatus, we recognize that there's a lot of room for growth for Black and Brown students, but there's a connection that has to always, be drawn, which is what is the relationship between students of color and their experience of school, and the relationship between educators of color. What is the relationship between being Black and Brown in America in relation to being Black and Brown in schools and systems, right? And so what we have to do is really, again, look at what is the ecosystem, what is that smog that Dr. Beverly Tatum speaks about, and how do we assess what's happening? And not just our own, well, this is, if I'm a white leader, which, most, I think 20% of school leaders around the country are identified as people of color, so very few, and 10% would be, Black school leaders. And so understanding that, and what does it mean as far as like school culture? How do we reflect on this? How was it constructed? Who was it created for? Who benefits from it and who feels marginalized within it? And then how do we go about this? And so having a group of stakeholders from different angles, different perspectives that have the right mindset about what it is that's trying to be accomplished, and using the school culture to really assess where we are, and also crafting a vision for what it possibly could be. And so this is the purpose of having this, classroom assessment, culture assessment, to really look at where it's not just the principal who's saying, "Oh, this is what I want to do," but getting various perspectives and insights in order to ensure that we are getting multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and that things are looking very differently for future educators of color within our schools and